3 years after Elspeth Hartwell had stood in her own front hallway and told her son that the baby Zoe was carrying was not his, she walked into the Millbrook Fall Fair and saw a little boy eating a caramel apple near the petting zoo. She stopped walking. The boy had Griffin's eyes, that same deep brown, with the slight downward tilt at the outer corners, the same way of holding his chin when he concentrated on something. He was 2, maybe 3, and he was trying very seriously to take a bite of his apple without getting caramel on his chin. Elspeth's chest went tight. The woman beside him, older, silver-haired, looked up and saw her staring. It was Edie, Zoe's mother. Edie picked the boy up without a word, turned her back, and walked in the other direction. Elspeth almost called out, almost. But she didn't. 3 years earlier, Zoe had been 26 years old and working the front desk at the Millbrook Community Health Center when Griffin walked in, looking for a referral form he'd lost. He came back the next week with a different excuse. And the week after that, eventually Zoe told him the forms were available on the clinic's website, and Griffin laughed, and finally just asked if she wanted to get coffee. They dated for nearly 2 years before he proposed. Zoe had not told Griffin much about her family history early on. Not because she was ashamed, but because some things need time. Eventually she told him everything, that her father had left when she was 3 months old and never come back, that her mother Edie had raised her alone in the east end of Millbrook, where the houses were smaller and the streets were older and people talked. That Edie had worked double shifts at a diner for years so that Zoe could have winter boots and school trips and eventually a college education. That some people in town still whispered about Edie the way small towns whisper about women who didn't fit the expected shape of a life. Griffin listened to all of it and said, quietly, that he thought Edie sounded like the toughest woman he had ever heard of. Zoe had loved him for that. What she hadn't anticipated was his mother. Elspeth Hartwell was a tall woman with excellent posture and an expression that suggested. She was always slightly disappointed with what she was seeing. Griffin's father had passed away when Griffin was 12, and Elspeth had raised her son alone on the west side of town, the side with the wide lots and the double garages. While managing a rental property and a small bookkeeping business, she was by most accounts capable and self-made. She was also the kind of woman who had decided that everything she had built needed to be protected, and that protection meant controlling who her son let in. The first time Griffin brought Zoe to meet her, Elspeth served tea and asked questions that sounded polite but weren't. She asked about Zoe's father within the first 15 minutes. She asked about Edie's situation. She smiled at all of Zoe's answers the way someone smiles when they're already planning their response. After they left, Elspeth called Griffin. Zoe wasn't there for that conversation, but Griffin told her about it later. His mother had said she wasn't sure Zoe was the right fit. She had said some things about backgrounds, about what families pass down, about how you couldn't always tell what you were getting. Griffin pushed back, they argued. He told his mother that he loved Zoe and that he was going to marry her. Elspeth gave her blessing 4 days later, not warmly but formally. Like signing a document you have reservations about but can't find a legal reason to refuse. The wedding was small. Elspeth had made that clear from the first conversation about it. She didn't see the point of a large reception. She didn't think extravagant spending was a good start to a marriage. Griffin knew she was making things difficult on purpose. He told Zoe the wedding itself didn't matter, that what they were building together was what mattered. Zoe agreed, or she told herself she agreed. She thought about her mother, who had never had a wedding at all, who had never worn a dress like that, who had cried getting ready that morning in the tiny bathroom of their East End house, touching Zoe's hair and not saying much. The ceremony was at a community hall. The flowers were nice. Edie sat in the front row and held her hands very still in her lap. It was enough. Zoe told herself it was enough. Moving into Elspeth's house was, in retrospect, the decision she would spend the longest time regretting. Griffin had suggested it as a temporary arrangement, 6 months, maybe a year, while they saved up. Elspeth had a large house with a spare wing. It seemed practical. What Zoe had not fully understood was that living in someone else's house meant living by someone else's rules, and that Elspeth's rules shifted depending on what she wanted to prove on any given day. The laundry was one of the first things. There was a perfectly good washer and dryer in the shared utility room, but Elspeth began leaving specific items outside Zoe's door, with a note asking that they be hand-washed. Not every item, just enough that Zoe couldn't call it a pattern without sounding petty. When Griffin mentioned it, Elspeth said she was simply protective of certain fabrics. The kitchen was another. Zoe worked long hours at the clinic. She tried to cook dinner most evenings when she got home. Elspeth would come downstairs while she was cooking and rearrange things behind her. Would say things like, "That's a lot of salt for that cut of meat," or "We usually do it this way." Not loudly, not cruelly exactly, just persistently like water finding the lowest point in a floor. Then, Portia arrived. Portia Sinclair was Griffin's ex-girlfriend. They dated briefly in their mid-20s, before he met Zoe. She came from one of the older Millbrook families, the kind of name you saw on the signs outside the arena and the hospital wing. She had gone away to work in Toronto for a few years, and had now, apparently, decided to move back. Elspeth changed when Portia came by the house. Zoe watched it happen from the kitchen doorway. Her mother-in-law's whole body language shifted, her voice went warmer. She touched Portia's arm and laughed at things that weren't particularly funny. She offered Portia the good tea, the imported kind she kept in the upper cabinet that Zoe had been told was for guests. Portia was gracious to Zoe, perfectly, carefully gracious. She complimented the chicken Zoe had made. She said things like, "Griffin is so lucky," in a tone that somehow sounded like a polite correction. She and Elspeth sat together on the good sofa after dinner and talked about people Zoe didn't know, and Zoe cleaned up the kitchen alone. Griffin took Zoe's hand that night before bed. "She's harmless," he said. "She means well." Zoe didn't argue, but she lay awake for a while. The argument that finally made them move out came on a Tuesday in March. Elspeth had said something about Edie, something specific, about choices and consequences, and how certain kinds of women raise certain kinds of daughters, and Zoe had not stayed quiet. She had said, carefully but clearly, that she would not allow her mother to be spoken about that way in her own presence. Elspeth had gone still. Then she'd said very calmly that Zoe had no respect for the home she was being allowed to live in. Griffin was home that evening. He heard the end of it. He took Zoe's side. They were in their own rental apartment by the 1st of April. It wasn't much. A 2-bedroom unit in a building on the east side, closer to Edie, closer to the clinic. The ceilings were low and the radiators were loud, and Zoe thought it was the best place she had ever lived. For a few months, things were genuinely better. Griffin was at ease without his mother watching everything. They cooked together on weekends. They went to see Edie on Sundays. Zoe started thinking about what the next year might look like, and the shape of it seemed hopeful. Griffin's cousin Ronan was renting the unit 2 floors below them. Ronan was 32, worked as a paramedic, and was the kind of quiet, steady person who fixed things without being asked and didn't make a production of it. He'd help them move in. He sometimes joined them for dinner. He and Zoe got along in the uncomplicated way of two people who have nothing to prove to each other. Elspeth did not like it. When she came to visit, which happened more than Griffin had anticipated, she would see Ronan's boots by the door if he'd stopped by, or find him in the kitchen making coffee, and her expression would go flat. She said things to Griffin when Zoe wasn't in the room. Zoe could tell by the way Griffin would go slightly quiet afterward. Once, she heard Elspeth say to Griffin, "You don't think it's strange, a man like that always around your wife?" Griffin had told her she was being ridiculous. But the seed was there. The night everything broke was in November. Griffin was away for a work trip, 2 nights in Ottawa. Elspeth called and asked if Zoe wanted to come by for dinner, said she was trying, said she wanted things to be better between them. Zoe almost said no. She thought about calling Griffin to check in first. In the end, she decided to go. It felt like the decent thing to do. Portia was there when Zoe arrived. Elspeth said she'd dropped by unexpectedly, which wasn't true, but Zoe sat down anyway. The evening felt off from the beginning. Elspeth was almost too warm, too attentive, kept refilling Zoe's water glass, kept asking if she wanted more of the pasta, more of the salad, more of the dessert. Portia was quieter than usual. At some point, Zoe couldn't say exactly when, she started feeling heavy. Not sick exactly. More like her thoughts were moving slowly, like the room had gotten softer around the edges. She asked if she could lie down for a moment in the guest room. Elspeth said, "Of course, come with me." Zoe woke up to Griffin's voice. She opened her eyes and the room was dark, and Griffin was standing in the doorway and beside her in the bed. She did not understand how, she did not understand any of it, was Ronan. He was still dressed, lying on top of the covers. She had been under the covers. She didn't know how either of them had gotten there. Griffin's face. She will never forget Griffin's face. "Griffin," She sat up. She was still in her clothes. Griffin, I don't know how. Don't. His voice was very quiet. Behind him in the hallway, she could see Elspeth's face, and something in Elspeth's expression, some flicker that was not grief, not shock, not the face of a woman witnessing something terrible, told Zoe exactly what had happened. She had been set up. She said it clearly, looking at Griffin. She did this. Your mother arranged this. Elspeth made a sound of disbelief and turned to Griffin. She wakes up next to another man, and the first thing she does is blame me. Griffin, this is the woman you married. Ronan came awake, genuinely came awake, disoriented, confused, the real confusion of someone who didn't know where he was or how he'd gotten there. He looked at Zoe. He looked at Griffin. He said, "What's going on? Where am I?" It didn't matter what either of them said. Griffin had seen what he had seen. What happened next, Zoe does not talk about in detail even now. What she will say is this: he did not listen. She was explaining and he was not listening. She told him she thought she'd been given something, that she'd felt strange at dinner, that she had not gone to bed with Ronan or asked him there or wanted him there. She told him to look at her, really look. And he did, but he was looking at her the way you look at something you've already decided about. His mother stood in the doorway and said nothing, and that silence was the loudest thing in the room. When Zoe told him she was pregnant, she had found out 5 days earlier, had been saving it, had been thinking about how to tell him. His face went through something she cannot fully describe. He said, "How am I supposed to believe that's mine?" She had no answer for that, not because she didn't have the words, but because the person standing in front of her was someone she no longer recognized. Elspeth stepped into the room. She looked at Zoe. She said, in the same flat, certain voice she used for everything, "You should leave." Griffin did not stop her from leaving. She called a cab from the front steps. It was November, and cold, the deep kind of cold that gets into your coat, and she sat there and waited and did not allow herself to fall apart until she was inside her mother's house. Edie opened the door at midnight and looked at her daughter's face and didn't say a single word. She just pulled her inside and held her. The weeks that followed were the hardest Zoe had ever lived. Griffin did not call for 10 days. When he finally did, it was not to apologize. He said he needed time, that things were complicated, that his mother was upset. Zoe told him to contact her lawyer. She had found one the day before. She had also filed a police report about the night at Elspeth's, not because she expected an immediate outcome, but because she wanted it on record. She wanted every detail documented, the timeline, the feeling of being sedated, the fact that she'd woken up in a bed she hadn't chosen. Ronan filed his own statement. He was as certain as she was that something had been put in the food or drinks. The officer who took Zoe's report had been matter-of-fact and thorough. That had helped in a way she hadn't expected, being believed by someone whose job required evidence. She also had her blood work done privately. The results, 2 weeks later, showed trace evidence consistent with a sedative compound. She saved everything, every document, every message, every receipt. The divorce papers came 7 weeks later. There was language about the child inserted at Elspeth's insistence, implying that paternity was in question. Zoe's lawyer read it and went very still, and then said, with remarkable calm, that this would not be difficult to address. The community talked. She expected that. She had grown up watching them talk about Edie, and she knew exactly how it went. The lowered voices at the pharmacy, the looks in the parking lot, the women who had been warm to her face for 2 years who now found reasons to look past her. She walked through it the same way Edie had always walked through it, straight, steady, chin up, not asking anyone's permission to exist. Edie made soup on the cold nights. Ronan, who had his own quiet fury about what had been done to him, came by occasionally and fixed the things in Edie's house that needed fixing. Sometimes he stayed for dinner. He did not ask Zoe for anything she wasn't ready to give. In the spring, she gave birth to a boy. He came out with Griffin's eyes and Griffin's chin and a full head of dark hair. And he screamed with enormous conviction. And the nurse said, "He's got some opinions, this one." And Zoe laughed and cried at the same time. Edie, standing in the corner of the room, pressed her hand over her mouth and made no sound at all for a long moment. They named him Oliver. Oliver grew up in Edie's East End house, with the small backyard and the old maple tree, and the neighbors who had known Edie for 30 years. He learned to walk in that kitchen. He learned to talk in that living room. He was loud and curious and affectionate, and he looked more like Griffin with every passing month, and Zoe looked at him sometimes with a feeling she couldn't fully name. Not grief, not anger, just a stubborn and absolute love that had made itself into a floor to stand on. She went back to work at the clinic when Oliver was 5 months old. She enrolled in a health administration certificate program in the evenings. Edie watched Oliver those nights, and Ronan watched him sometimes on the weekends when Edie needed rest. Oliver called Ronan by his name and followed him around the backyard with great seriousness. 2.5 years passed. Griffin remarried. People told Zoe this as though she needed to know. She absorbed it without comment. She heard, through the natural circulation of a small town's information, that Portia had not actually been the one he'd married. Someone from out of province. Someone Elspeth apparently had her own reservations about. She heard also from a cousin of Ronan's who worked in property management that Portia had quietly departed Millbrook sometime in the previous year, apparently ahead of some financial issues connected to a property deal that had gone badly wrong. The details were vague and third-hand, and Zoe did not look for more. She didn't need them. It was at the Millbrook Fall Fair when Elspeth saw Oliver for the first time. Edie told Zoe about it that same evening. She described the way Elspeth had gone still, the way she'd stared, described picking Oliver up and walking away, and Elspeth standing there on the midway, not following. Zoe felt something cold move through her chest. "She'll try something," Edie said, stirring her tea. "I know," Zoe said. She was right. 3 days later, Zoe's phone rang with an unknown number. She let it go to voicemail. The message was Elspeth's voice, formal, controlled, asking if they could meet, saying she had something to discuss, saying it was about Oliver. Zoe did not call back. A week after that, Elspeth came to the clinic. She came in the middle of the morning, when the waiting room was full and Zoe was behind the desk scheduling follow-up appointments. She stood at the counter and said, quietly, "I need to speak with you." Zoe finished what she was typing. Then she looked up. "This is my workplace," she said. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't come here." Elspeth's jaw tightened. "I have seen my grandson. I know who he is." "He's my son," Zoe said. "He doesn't belong to you." "Griffin has a right." Griffin made his position very clear. Zoe kept her voice even. "There were people in the waiting room. She was aware of all of them. He did that in front of you. You were there." Something moved across Elspeth's expression. Not quite remorse, but close to it. The look of someone who has been watching something recede in the rearview mirror for 3 years and has finally pulled over. "I know," she said very quietly, "that I was wrong about certain things." "I need you to leave now," Zoe said. "If you or Griffin have legal questions, you can direct them to my lawyer." She wrote down the contact information on a notepad, slid it across the counter, and turned back to her computer. Elspeth stood there for a moment. Then she picked up the paper and left. Zoe typed 3 wrong characters before she noticed. She deleted them, took a slow breath, and started again. She told Ronan about it that evening. They were on Edie's back porch, Oliver asleep inside. The October air sharp enough that they'd brought out a blanket. Ronan listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to rely on. The specific quality of his attention, the way he held space for things without needing to fill it. "What do you want to do?" he asked when she'd finished. Zoe thought about it honestly. "Nothing dramatic. I want to live my life. I want Oliver to grow up feeling safe." Ronan nodded. "Then that's what happens." He said it the way he said most things, without drama, without inflation, like a simple fact they were agreeing to. The legal process that followed was handled quietly through their lawyers. Zoe's lawyer sent a letter. It was a thorough letter. It detailed the events of the November night 3 years earlier, attached the police report, included the blood work results, referenced Ronan's statement, and summarized the documented pattern of conduct during the marriage. It also outlined clearly what Zoe was and was not prepared to consider. She was not prepared to have Oliver spend time with Elspeth. That was not negotiable, and she would not be moved on it. She would consider, in time, a carefully managed arrangement for Griffin to begin building a relationship with his son, if he was willing to acknowledge what had happened, if he was willing to do the work, and if Oliver's well-being remained the only priority. But that time was not now. The letters from Griffin's lawyer went quiet for a while after that. Griffin's second marriage ended the following spring. People told Zoe, because people in Millbrook always told you things. She thanked them politely and didn't ask for details. She was not glad, she was not particularly sorry. She felt very little about it, which was its own kind of answer about how far she had come. That same month, Ronan asked her to dinner. Not coffee, not a sundae at Edie's, Dinner just the two of them, somewhere with actual tablecloths. Zoe looked at him across Edie's kitchen table, and something in his face was so steady, so patient, so completely without calculation, that she said yes before she'd thought it all the way through. Edie, who had been pretending to read the paper at the other end of the table, turned a page with extraordinary composure. Oliver's first day of junior kindergarten was in September. Zoe walked him to the door of his classroom at the school 5 blocks from Edie's house, and he let go of her hand and walked straight in without looking back, because that was exactly the kind of boy he was. Certain, purposeful, comfortable in himself. The teacher caught Zoe's eye and smiled. Walking home alone afterward, Zoe passed the coffee shop on Millbrook's Main Street. The leaves were turning on the elms. A few people nodded to her on the sidewalk, the way neighbors nod when they've seen each other enough times that hellos don't need a reason. She thought about Edie, who had walked into this same town with nothing but a pregnancy and a suitcase, and stayed for 30 years and built something real. She thought about Oliver, who had Griffin's eyes and would grow up knowing exactly who he was and where he came from, and who had chosen, without hesitation, to love him. She thought about Elspeth, who would grow old in that West Side house with the right postal code and the carefully maintained reputation, and who would know that she had seen a grandchild's face once, at a fall fair from a distance. And that was everything she was going to get. Zoe stopped at the coffee shop and ordered a medium dark roast and stood at the window while they made it, watching the maple trees do what maple trees do in October. She was 29 years old. She had a son who walked into rooms like he already belonged there. She had a mother who had shown her, without ever saying it directly, that surviving something cruel was not the same as being defined by it. She had a man in her life who had been quietly beside her through the worst of it and had never once asked to be thanked. She had built something real. And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, the future felt entirely, unambiguously hers.